Hi, I'm Max.
Robson here.
And I'm Trevor.
Today we're going to be talking about a podcast within a podcast. This podcast is called Serial. It has been running for a while now, and they have started season 2. I don't know if you heard about it, but we're going to be talking about season 1. It's about a crime committed in Baltimore, and Sarah Koenig is the host.
15 years ago, too.
15 years ago. And she's trying to work through the crime and see who committed it.
Investigate, because a man was convicted, but there's questions about whether or not this man was actually guilty or not. So the show's creators trying to figure out, was a man wrongfully convicted, and if so, what really happened?
Yeah, and just beforehand, if you haven't by chance listened to Serial and you wish to listen to Serial, I suggest that you stop listening as of now. I cannot guarantee that spoilers will not be had in this podcast.
There will be spoilers.
There will definitely be spoilers.
We'll be arguing.
So if you have not seen or listened to, if you haven't listened to season 1 of Serial, I highly recommend you do so, because we certainly won't do it justice. You just have to listen to it to yourself, really.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's very good. So don't get
so
all your information
please leave
from us.
if you haven't listened to the podcast.
We don't want you.
yeah.
So does someone want to start by explaining the story of Adnan and what happened
Some background
15
to
years
the
ago?
case.
Yeah, pretty much like the background.
Okay, so this case starts 15 years ago in a magnet school in Maryland called Woodlawn High School, and a girl goes missing, a girl named Heyman Lee, and her ex-boyfriend is arrested. Ex-boyfriend's name is Adnan Masood Syed. He's arrested in regards to this case because there was a witness today named Jay Wilds who testifies that Adnan killed her and he was with Adnan when the crime happened. And according to his evidence, evidence, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he was there to bury the body and help move her car. And so he testified in court that Adnan committed this murder, and he was convicted.
Adnan was convicted. Jay struck a deal with the police.
Yeah, and Jay walked free.
Jay walked free because he testified against Adnan and was able to provide enough evidence. So he was pretty much, you should say, like the anti-alibi.
Yeah, but at the same time, there was no evidence actually linking, like physical evidence linking Adnan to the case. So there was no DNA found in hay that matched Adnan. The only evidence against Adnan was essentially Jay's testimony and sort of circumstantial kind of things. There was no I guess hard proof that it was him.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes this case interesting because there's a lot of gray zone, I suppose, in terms of guilt.
Yeah, lot of, as I described, moving variables, like parts that sometimes can't be accounted for, changing stories. At one point in time, a girl came forward and said, I saw Adnan at the library, and then later retracted that statement for whatever reason.
And then put it back out there again.
Yeah, put it back out there again. So in Serial, it doesn't. They try to analyze each individual part. Sometimes where there was a cell phone record, basically that the police tried to use to pinpoint and point at Adnan and say you were at this point at this time. But the problem was sometimes Jay's testimony against Adnan did not match up with the cell phone records at time. And I think this was the first case that cell phone records had been used as.
And they weren't used well.
No.
Adnan gets a retrial this February, and one of the main pieces of evidence that his side will be expected to use is lack of reliability with cell phone evidence, and basically that the fact that his case hinged on the cell phone evidence was not at all conclusive, and this was not evidence that should have been admitted in the first place. And also, yeah, again, like Trevor said, Jay's story does not make sense.
Speaking we can transition into the evidence against Adnan in the case.
Oh yeah, in general.
The Nisha call.
So the Nisha call.
The Nisha call is a big one. So I listened to this show months ago, and so I'm kind of iffy in the details. I know the Nisha call was essentially a thing where a call was made to someone that only Adnan knew, a girl named Nisha.
And had been talking to.
Yes, but it was on Jay's phone. And since Jay didn't know her, it means that Adnan was with Jay that day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was on Adnan's phone, but Adnan said that Jay had his phone at this time.
There was a lot of changing of cars and phones because.
Adnan's story was I was at
he
school
said it was
the
a
whole
butt
day.
dial because he said it was.
Yeah, a butt dial.
Okay,
That was like a reference to like a butt dial.
So it was Adnan's phone, but the main piece of evidence there is that prosecution used it to, I guess, prove that Adnan was there with Jay. because Adnan's story was I was at school the whole time, went to track practice, blah blah blah, nothing out of the ordinary happened.
Yeah.
Whereas Jay was saying we ditched school, we smoked pot, and Adnan said I'm going to kill this person, essentially pick me up, and help me hide the body.
Yeah, and like speaking more on that, like I'm incredibly surprised that a huge part of like it would be Adnan's alibi was basically I was at track practice, but I find it incredibly difficult to believe that not a single person could testify and say I specifically remember Adnan was at track practice. But that's
to be fair. It's
15
I don't, years ago.
Yeah, no, it was 15 years
ago. Every single day.
But
I couldn't name someone who was at practice last year for track, and this is last year. This is 15 years.
But like,
there's
definitely not an attendance record or something.
Although at the same time, if Adnan didn't do it, there are so many coincidences that it's almost unbelievable that he couldn't have done it, just because the fact that say it wasn't Adnan, say Adnan was at school, his best friend turns on him, Nisha calls his phone.
Who were they even that good of friends?
Yeah, they didn't even know Jay. Actually, that's a good point. Like Jay and Adnan weren't close at all. If Adnan didn't do it, why would Jay make this up? He didn't even know him. Why would Nisha's phone? Why would Nisha have called him somewhere other than school? Why? Like it's just too many coincidences stacking up against Adnan to believe that it was all.
Do you want to talk about Jay's story just to show the coincidences? I kind of wanted to talk about how what Jay said happened, and then the host of Serial basically did a rerun of what happened to see if it was possible, and it was possible.
It was tight.
It was like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Like everything had to be completely perfect.
Basically, the story that Jay gave was, at school that day, Adnan asks Hey for a ride, and they go to Best Buy, where Adnan strangles her in the car, and then goes to the payphone at Best Buy to ask Jay for help, basically. But when the creators of the show tried to reenact it, essentially, they went to Woodlawn High School and tried to drive him there to Best Buy. They found that the time frame between school ending and when the prosecution claimed the murder happened would have left almost no time for Adnan to have gotten the ride, gone to Best Buy, done the murder. I think there was it's like a 30-second margin of error there. And also, it's not at all clear. No one testifies that there actually was a payphone at Best Buy. There's no evidence for there being a payphone at Best Buy. So Jay's story really has so many holes in it. Now, of course, that wouldn't mean that Adnan is innocent. It just means that Jay's story is obviously not the whole truth.
Yeah. Well, payphone or not, somehow a call was made, because obviously Jay knew to go to Best Buy. So whether it was on a payphone or not, maybe he borrowed a cell phone, because I'm not sure how it worked in the 90s, but from what I can understand, you just remember people's phone numbers.
I mean, Best Buy had phones.
Yeah, Best Buy had phones. There's nothing to say that you couldn't make a phone call. You definitely sell phones. I mean, this is Best Buy in the 90s, but as you were saying, the problem with that is that the time window is so short. It's like a 22-minute window to commit a crime, and the hard part with Jay's story is that it changed. It changed multiple times, and through the police doing cross-referencing and fact-checking what he said, they found out that he wasn't entirely telling the truth the entire time. For instance, there was a point in time when Jay said that I knew about the murder beforehand. Like Adnan was saying, I'm going to commit this crime it was a day before, a week before, and then there were some times when he told the story, he said, I didn't know until the day of, or I didn't know until he called me. So just that simple changing of facts, and then the short time period, and then the cell phone record after, it's like a real rickety, it's not a solid foundation in which
the prosecution story is just a jumbled mess. And I mean, personally, I believe that Adnan is guilty, but I don't believe he's been convicted because, again, the prosecution's case needs to be beyond reasonable doubt. In this case, it just isn't. So no matter if he did it or not, which I believe he did, you need to have conclusive evidence and a conclusive story backing up this claim, and that doesn't exist in this case.
Yeah. And also, I was just going back to what Trevor said about the changing of the story, there's that huge, like, we went to this, like, park place to smoke, and then when it was, shown that was, like, impossible to, like,
It was too far away.
Too far away. Then he said we just did it in the car on the way to, like, Lincoln Park.
Lincoln Park,
whatever that was.
Where they supposedly buried her. There's also Mr.
Mr. S, who found the body.
So I was just gonna say the state's timeline is like riddled with holes, and like I think at some point there was one of Hayes' friends who I don't remember if she was close to Adnan or not, but she was definitely like close with Hay, and they both like were managers for wrestling, and she said that like there was like Best Buy was at 3:30 or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. She said she was talking with Hay long enough that it couldn't have been possible for her to be murdered at Best Buy.
Because after school, according to this Hayes' friend and Hay were talking in the gym because there was some kind of wrestling meet.
There was
There was an away meet, and they were talking about it, and she didn't know how to run the points yet. So when she showed up and Hay wasn't there, obviously because she was dead, she realized like maybe something had gone wrong, but like, that was her story. Because
what that means is the state's case was already dependent on an incredibly thin margin of time, and if Hay was talking to this friend at the gym when school ended, that means that the state's case is impossible, essentially, just time-wise.
Yeah. I also want to, like, I said yesterday, I listened to an interview on, I think it was like New York Radio Hour, and it would talk to Sarah Koenig, and it was like a comparison between season 2 and season 1. I'm going to mention season 2 very briefly. It's currently in production. It's now bi-weekly. I think they just released episode 4
last week.
Yeah, last week. So in a week or so, we can expect episode 5 of season 2. And season 2 focuses around
different story entirely.
Bo Bergdahl, who was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan in, I think it was May or June of 2013. No, it couldn't have been 13 because he was released after 5 years. It was like, so basically he was captured for 5 years, and he was released through a prisoner exchange.
He was released pretty recently.
Yeah. And now he's on martial court.
He's being court-martialed.
Court-martialed, which is the highest level of military court.
The military is trying him, basically.
The military is trying him for
desertion,
which is punishable up to life imprisonment.
Yeah.
But aside from that, there's a huge difference on how Koenig decided to run the operation. Because Bo is being tried by court-martial, was it?
Yeah.
She never specifically talks to Bo, which is polar opposite to how she ran her reporting on season 1, where Adnan was at the Maryland State Correctional Facility, and she would literally call him, and they would talk on the phone, him on the prison phone, her on her cell phone, her home phone,
hours at a time.
Adnan was in this show so often,
Mm-hmm.
which makes some people think that essentially Adnan was almost playing the show. Yeah, so essentially it seems to some people that Adnan is almost using the show to sort of argue his case, almost in a way generate sympathy for his imprisonment.
For his situation.
Which, if he's innocent, then totally that's a great thing to do. That the show's done a huge service. But assuming he's guilty, which is also a reasonable position to take, it's more sinister, because he's using public opinion to subvert the system of justice, which is dangerous.
Yeah, and like more, I had like not so much a theory, but I had like a realization that on either situation, Serial's done like pretty much a humongous service, because now he has this entire, I want to say fan base, but an entire, essentially a fan base of people who can, who he's got like either believing that he's innocent or guilty. Like he has this reasonable doubt. He wins either situation. If he truly is innocent, then he's got people thinking that he's got this sense of doubt. So he makes it out, whether he leaves somehow, he gets a retrial and he leaves, or he stays. Even if he stays in prison, he stays in prison almost as a martyr, as someone once said, because it's forever like this a scenario where it's like, oh, he could be innocent. You know, he's got such a strong pull of people who think that he's honestly innocent that he can sit in jail and
have the moral high ground.
Oh, have the moral high ground. So he has like the moral high ground in either situation, which is honestly probably like the perfect situation for him right now. If you're serving a life sentence,
it's almost a win-win.
It's nice to know that you've got like a community on people on the outside. So yeah, and then that was good. What else do we have? Did anyone want to talk about like the jury, or?
Robson has some thoughts about it.
Yeah, Robson has some thoughts on the jury.
Okay.
As a Muslim.
So full disclosure, I am Muslim.
So is Adnan.
Yeah, and so is Adnan.
Pakistani.
Yeah, Pakistani compared
Robson's
to an
no.
Ethiopian. But yeah, that just listening to the jurors almost made me sick. Like, they didn't seem like bad people, but they were like wholly ignorant of what it meant to be an American Muslim. Like, they never like mentioned his religion as being a thing that would like change their opinion of him.
But the prosecution did. Prosecution used his religion as part of the motive.
The prosecution did, but I'm talking about the jurors right now, friend. So,
Dang.
the jurors brought up the concept of culture a lot. And that was like, oh, in his culture, women are second-class citizens. In his culture, like, this was a thing that, like, betrayed his pride. Culture this, culture that, as if they knew. But the biggest thing here is he's not, like, a Pakistani. He's a Pakistani-American. And his culture isn't wholly Pakistani. Like, I don't know how many Pakistani people fresh off the boat, they're like smoking weed and having girlfriends and stuff. That's not a very Muslim thing to do. That's a very American thing, but not a Muslim thing.
Plus, he was born here. Adnan was born in the U.S. He's an American citizen wholeheartedly. He's been to school with Americans. He's not this. He isn't this new arrival who's hasn't yet accepted the culture. He's a full American.
And and now to talk about the prosecution, we can double team this. So, with the prosecution, they brought up like the one woman who was just constantly bringing up like how she thought there was a similar case in Chicago, and the only similarities were that it was a murder committed by a Pakistani who knew the person beforehand, and that man was Pakistani. He wasn't even like Adnan. He wasn't a Pakistani American, but they just kind of made a lot of parallels that didn't exist.
Yeah,
because to be clear, the prosecution used his religion and culture as almost part of the motive. Their case was essentially that when Hay dumped Adnan, it was essentially an insult, because in traditional Pakistani culture, in Pashtun culture, this is the thing where it's a very patriarchal society, and so the prosecution's case was that because he was Pakistani, he reacted violently to Hayes dumping him, and so they used that as his primary motive.
Well, like, and that was like an entire focus of like the first couple of episodes, like Adnan's relationship with Hay, and like was he hurt over it? Was he fine with it? And you got really conflicting stories, and that brings up a humongous point of like what I feel is like kind of like the crutch, if that's the right word, like the big crust. Glowing, not the crust, but like the big problem that I see with, not the crux, I don't know, crux, like the big problem that I see with Serial is it attempts to make judgments based solely on personality. Yeah. And Adnan specifically references this. He says, you don't know me, even though he was defending her. Mm-hmm. Or she was defending him. She was defending him, and she said, I don't know if you were trying to stay capable for this. You seem like a good guy. You went to mosque. You got good grades. You were involved. And he specifically says, we've only been talking for a year, and you hardly know me. Mm-hmm. Well, as eerie as that sounds, that's like the big problem. It's because like, it's an influencer. I feel like
even in the original trials, like. they like both sides were kind of just like two like crippled people hitting each other, like because the prosecution, they basically had Jay in a faulty timeline, and then the defense had like a bunch of character witnesses with nothing to like say.
And a client with no alibi.
Because the case had no hard evidence, so both sides were just using conjecture. Basically, there was no proof on either side. There still is no proof.
Like pride isn't. That's not evidence. You can't
So
like
subjective.
it's motive, but pride is subjective. Like what, and people try to make the jury tried to make these like this analysis in their head, like, oh, if pride's gonna be like what hurt his pride, like what do I think I know about
The
Muslims?
motive makes no sense.
Yeah.
An American teenager would not do an honor killing. An American teenager born in the U.S. will not follow the traditional Pashtun code of ritual. This does not make any sense. For
Unfortunately,
someone,
we have to wrap it up soon. We have like 2 minutes left. So I just think we should go around and say what we think for our final
Like closing statements.
closing statements.
Okay, who wants to start?
I believe that he's guilty. However, the trial was done horribly wrong, and that he shouldn't have been convicted, and that even though there's too many coincidences that would say that he didn't do it, like I've got to say that personally, I do think he did.
I suspect his guilt, but suspicion isn't good enough to convict, and I think he should not have been sent to jail. Even though I have questions about his integrity as a person and as almost a character in the show, I think he should be a free man today.
I am wholly undecided whether or not I believe he is guilty or not, but I will continue to look into this and make my own decisions at a later date.
I think he's guilty. I do agree that the case was done pretty badly. It was conducted in a bad manner, but they make comparisons to other cases, and apparently this is pretty much the norm in the American judicial system. So Serial does a great job of making those like underlying comments about the American judicial system. I think he's guilty. I don't know whether he should be convicted now or not, because it's hard to look at Hae-Min Lee's parents in the eyes and say, "I'm sorry, your daughter's dead. We suspect that he's guilty, but we just don't have enough hard evidence." Like that's a hard call to make. I feel like in his retrial in February, a lot of things will be put to rest.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.